We're going to talk about ordinance and law, because apparently when I ask you guys what you want to hear about in a poll, you guys want to hear really boring policy-related stuff. So, screw you guys. I guess I'll talk about ordinance and law. My name is Mathew Mulholland. A little bit of background, very briefly. I had a roofing company early on in my career called All Good Roof Systems in Georgia. We did very little. I sucked at knocking on doors. And then I started a PA firm after I became a public adjuster, find out that existed, called All Good Adjustments, and we were handling like 3,000 claims a year. We became the largest PA firm in Georgia at the time. I was doing mostly residential volume, mostly roof claims. We transferred slowly into commercial and large loss type things, and until that became our entire book of business, we sold to another company. During that time, we had a podcast called Listen to This Bull. And you can still find that on YouTube. And there's a lot of 10, 15-minute educational videos on how actual pieces of the policy are supposed to work. There's also a podcast every Tuesday at 6 p.m. called Listen to This Bull Live, where we talk about bullshit in the insurance world. And there's so much to talk about that we will never run out of things to talk about. Then I started a school called National Claims Institute. I left that school. Now I started a school called Building Experts Institute, way better. And I am the current vice president of APIA. I was a past president of GAPIA. I'm a member of FAPIA. I'm a board advisor of APA. And apparently I'm on the board of the thing here. So, that's everything. All right, so what is ordinance and law coverage? Do you know that you can actually go on insurance companies' websites and find some gold sometimes? It's pretty awesome. This is what Nationwide's website says ordinance and law coverage is. It says ordinance and law insurance covers the cost to rebuild a home that has been destroyed, as well as the cost to upgrade a home so that it meets the most up-to-date building codes after a covered loss. So apparently, ordinance and law coverage covers the cost to rebuild a home. Did you guys know that? I didn't know that. They go on. There are two types of coverages that fall under ordinance and law: cost to upgrade and rebuilding expenses. In the event your home is fully or partially destroyed by a covered loss event, ordinance and law coverage will help to cover the cost of updating your house to ensure it meets current building codes. I'm okay with that. If your home needs to be replaced, repaired, or upgraded after a loss, ordinance and law insurance will help pay for the efforts needed to meet current building codes, laws, ordinances. So if your home needs to be replaced, repaired, or upgraded, so replaced or repaired gives you money apparently according to nationwide.com. So if you have ordinance and law coverage, you can use it towards the repairs and replacement according to Nationwide. So that means if you exhaust coverage A, you got some extra money. So it's like extra expense. So in order to determine if you need ordinance or law coverage, consider the age of your home. If you live in an older home and experience a loss, for instance, you may be more likely to have to upgrade to current building codes compared to living in a newer home that already meets up-to-date requirements. So now let's just talk about upgrades. It's a little bit confusing. It feels like AI wrote it. Probably did. But that's Nationwide. If they ever say that you can't use ordinance and law coverage to just rebuild something, you can point to Nationwide's website. I've never had that argument from them. Has anybody ever had that from them? Where they say you can't do it? Because usually we're trying to get it the other way around. All right. That was there. When selling an insurance policy, they often put something in something called policy notices that they might end up attaching to a policy later on. But when trying to sell you a policy, Farmers Insurance says this: this coverage pays for increased costs incurred from rebuilding your home in compliance with updated building codes. Contact your agent to learn more. So this is all about updating to building code. A little bit different than what Nationwide said. The Nationwide language in their policy is a little bit different than what the Farmers language in the policy is. Anybody want to guess which company has the stricter language, or really the longest amount of language on it? Farmers. Farmers has it's the longest freaking policy ever. It's crazy. You guys know the SMART plan? The well aptly named, clearly, SMART plan? All right, so we're going to talk about what the hell is meant by increased costs. We're going to get into whether or not compliance with the code is part of ordinance and law, what we are talking about when we say pay when incurred, that infamous word enforcement, and then we'll find out if this is an exclusion, is it a coverage, is it additional coverages, is it both? Get into all this. I'm going to pick on farmers because it has a very detailed policy. Sometimes we can use that against them. I'll tell you at the end how I do that. This is the Texas Farmer Smart Plan policy, and it talks about that they will pay for increased costs in yellow that you actually and necessarily incur in blue when you repair, replace, rebuild, demolish, or remove, hereinafter repair, cover damages to the dwelling because of or resulting from the enforcement of any building law. And they put building law in bold, which means they defined it. So at the bottom is their definition. It means any governmental ordinance, code, regulation, order, or law which regulates the repair, replacement, rebuilding, demolition, or removal of covered damage to the dwelling or a separate structure. So it's really interesting that they put the words covered damage in there because building laws generally don't say anything about covered damages. They just talk about replacement, rebuilding, and demolition. But I'm going to let that slide. That's kind of shitty on their part, bad language. All the green things on here talk about enforcement. All the yellow things on here talk about increased costs or what is actually paid. Or actually, oh, I messed up. Blue is increased cost. Yellow is compliance. I always screw up a few things in my slides. It's kind of par for the course. So for farmers, it pays for an increased cost. Does anybody know what increased costs are? So if this contractor was charging more than this contractor, is that an increased cost for that contractor? Yeah, well, that was actually pretty good. I'll get to it. Call Ani again, you can try to repeat that. That'll be fun. All right, so Allstate says something different. This is the Allstate building code coverage. It's not ordinance and law coverage, it's building code coverage. It's roughly the same thing. Ordinance and law and ordinance, ordinance or law, law or ordinance, building code coverage, building upgrade coverage, code upgrade coverage, code coverage, all of these things are roughly the same thing. They're just trademarking their own name for it, I guess, because it's an additional coverage and they're selling it. For building code coverage in Allstate's policy, it says we will pay up to the limit of liability shown on the policy declarations for building codes coverage to comply with local building codes after covered loss to the dwelling or when repair or replacement results in increased costs due to the enforcement. So it says increased costs, but it also says to comply with the code. How many of you had Allstate tell you that they're not going to pay to replace the flashing or the decking on a roof when you said it's required by code because they don't have building code coverage? People that are outside of Texas. All right, Ohio, that's happened to you? Yeah. No one in Texas has had that argument? God, your state is amazing. Oh well. That'll happen eventually. They'll catch up to it. There is a difference here. This one says two different things. It's to comply with local building codes or when repair or replacement results in increased cost. Farmers only paid for the increased cost. Nationwide, because of the way that they put in this language, probably says to comply or to increase because they're talking about the rebuild cost. So, if it's to comply with code, does that mean you need ordinance and law in order to comply with building code? If they don't have building code coverage on their policy, does that mean that they don't pay for any compliance with code? Obviously, they couldn't be that way. Everything has a code attached to it. If you're complying with code when doing any kind of building construction, that's got to be part of the normal course of construction. That can't be additional amounts. It's not an increased cost. In how we pay for a loss, Allstate says payment under A, B, and C above, that's coverage as A, B, and C, will not include any increased cost due to enforcement. It doesn't say it will not include any compliance with code. It only excludes the increased cost. So the building code coverage pays for increased cost or compliance. Coverages A and B and C don't pay for increased cost But they don't say that they don't pay for compliance. So I have an overlap of compliance coverage. I've got compliance coverage in coverages A, B, and C, and I have an additional compliance coverage in building code coverage if I want. Or increased cost over there. I'm not going to get increased costs on A, B, or C. So ordinance and law pays for compliance with code, which depends on the policy, probably that nation one of the farmers. Increased costs caused by the enforcement. We'll get into enforcement in a little bit. The demolition and replacement of undamaged property. This is not very fast. Come on. Actually, I'm going to get into undamaged in a different slide. It may or may not be an additional coverage, but coverage A plays a reasonable and necessary cost to repair or replace. It excludes increased cost and does not exclude compliance. So it'll pay for compliance, and so will ordinance and law in some policies. If the policy doesn't say that it covers compliance or increased cost, then the ordinance and law coverage in that policy doesn't pay for the compliance at all, only increased cost. So farmers would not pay you anything for compliance with code, with their ordinance and law language. You'd have to put that under coverages A, B, and C. You guys see the difference? Yeah, very exciting topic. All right, replacement cost versus increased cost. It pays to remove and replace what's there with materials of like kind and quality for equivalent construction, similar use, all that kind of crap. So if you have materials that are being replaced and they're there, then they have a replacement cost value. If you're upgrading something or having to add something to a structure, in Georgia, they started implementing IRC IBC 2012, which introduced in the state drip edge. And it became a requirement in 2014 for the first time. So no houses had drip edge. So it wasn't there. So when replacing a roof, you're tearing off a roof, there's no drip edge to tear off. Therefore, there's no like kind of quality to put back. The replacement cost value of that drip edge was $0. If I have to install drip edge, there is an increased cost because the drip edge actually costs more than $0, believe it or not. So there's an increase. Is there something there to remove? If there is, that has a value worth like kind of quality dollars. If there's nothing there to remove, then there's no value and it's all increase. If there is something there to remove, what is the value of that thing versus what you have to install? And that difference in cost is the increase. Not all of it, just the increase. So, let me give you an example. I don't know if you guys know this, but flashing, according to the building code, has to be 26 gauge, 0.0195 inches thick. This is step flashing that is sold at Home Depot. It is not 0.0195 or 0.019 according to that code on the bottom there. It's 0.011. It is too thin. It's actually 28 gauge. That's all the flashing that they sell is non-compliance. If you ever have a contractor say that they get all their materials from Home Depot, the roof they're installing is not compliant. Just so you know, they sell bullshit. In case you didn't know what bullshit was. That is what is on a lot of buildings in the US. Non-compliant, step flashing. When I replace the roof, part of the roof job is to get all the way down to the deck. I have to remove the flashing. I can't reinstall the flashing if it's damaged, deteriorated, or rusted. If I'm replacing that flashing and I need to bring it up to code, what is the increased cost? There's a like kind of quality value of this shitty Home Depot flashing of, let's say it's $5 a linear foot. And then the real flashing that's actually 26 gauge might be $10 a linear foot. So there's a $5 a linear foot difference between these. So what is the increased cost that needs to be under ordinance and law?
5 times linear feet.
0, because I tricked you, because the line item in Xactimate just says step flashing period, so yeah. That should be the $5. You wouldn't put all of the step flashing money under ordinance and law. You would remove and replace in coverage A for the $5 a linear foot, and then put $5 a linear foot worth of increased cost into ordinance and law coverage. That's how it's actually supposed to be applied. Is it ever applied that way for you guys? If you were tearing off decking and replacing it with better decking, are they putting all of the decking under ordinance and law, or are they only putting the increase? They tend to put all of the decking under it, don't they? They're doing it wrong. And Home Depot should know better, because that's shitty. Anyway, so here's some examples. Increase above normal course of construction. Your normal course of construction, what's currently there. Law requires condemnation of a building and demolition of a remaining structure damaged by the covered peril. So there's a part of the building that gets condemned because of a direct loss, and the rest of that structure now has to be completely demolished as well. That could fall under ordinance and law because it's an increased cost over the normal repair methodology of the condemned part of the building. The code is requiring them to demolish the rest of it. If there's a city ordinance that requires shed roofs match with the dwelling, even if the shed roof isn't damaged, when you replace the dwelling roof, that's a city ordinance that has something to do with an undamaged portion of the property. That could be under ordinance and law because it's outside of the normal course of construction of the regular roof. You wouldn't have to replace a shed roof in order to properly replace a dwelling roof that's completely separated. It's an increase, and that's on undamaged portions. Local fire chief requires all electrical in a building be updated when any electrical work is done in the general area. Maybe a lot of the policies don't apply that under ordinance and law because there's no damage to the direct property. So if it just happens in the general area and they're forcing everyone to upgrade for some reason, that's actually well, shit, I forget the name of the word. Civil authority action that would not be part of ordinance and law code. But if you are doing a small portion of electrical work in your house and you have to upgrade all of it because the city is requiring you to, then it would be. All right, so what the hell is enforcement? When they say an increased cost caused by the enforcement, does that mean that somebody needs to be going at your property with a billy club and saying, you better frickin' do it or I'm not going to pay you? Is that enforcement? I mean, it is. Yeah, it totally is. But that's not the only thing that enforcement is. Can anybody tell me what their definition of enforcement is? Gotta have a volunteer. You guys, I'm dying. Pulling a permit? Withholding a permit is enforcement? Yes, so they're saying no, decline, they're not going to give you a permit to do the work that way. That could be enforcement. What do the insurance companies really want you to do? They want you to jump through some hoops, get 5 different building officials to write a letter saying we're going to, burn your house down if you don't do it this way or something. That sounds like enforcement. So there are some questions to ask. If we go down to the end of the ordinance and law coverage, it says the building law, this is the Farmer Smart Plan again, must one be adopted by the local government in which the dwelling is located. Adopted doesn't mean enforced by the local government. Be in force at the date of loss or damage. It has to have already been in force and required at the date of loss. And directly apply to the part of the dwelling or separate structure which sustained the covered damage. It doesn't say anything about permits at all. They're actually defining what they mean by it right there in a way. If this is what it actually says in the policy, then do we really need to get a permit for something that some building officials just don't want to give you a permit for because they don't give a shit about a repair? I have plenty of phone calls with certain building officials in certain counties in Georgia where they literally told me, I do not care if you replace that with cardboard. We don't enforce that. I was like, stop saying that word. You're using it wrong. I don't think this word means what you think it means, because it means something different for a contract than it does in common vernacular. This specifies what they mean. Is it the damaged part or the undamaged part? By the way, if you guys, let me see if I have this in the slides. Here's the city of Galveston, and they talk about what building codes are required. Galveston City seeks to promote the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare of the municipality and the safe, orderly, and healthful development of the municipality. By the way, if you ever want to have something from them or a building official's on your side, just tell the building official that it affects the safety of the occupants and you have a better chance. You have to give them a good reason. At the bottom here, it says that this organization, the building code, gives the authority to the building official, shall implement and enforce. Do you guys know what the word shall means? It's fucking mandatory. It's mandatory. If it says shall, there's no options. The building official doesn't have the option. The building official must implement and enforce the chapter according to the local government. They're required to. So it is enforced as a whole, regardless of what permitting or actions they perform. And this is in the city government. You can find it on their website. You can quote it if you need to. You don't need to get a building official to put something in writing for you when it clearly states that they're going to enforce it. And may establish such rules, regulations, or procedures not inconsistent with this chapter. Imagine if you had to get a building official to say they're going to enforce every specific code that's in the code book. The code books are really thick. How many building officials would have to be hired by the city to constantly say yes, 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 no, yes, yes, no, no, yes, to every question that you possibly ask them? There's a code for everything, including the nails you're using. It would be ridiculous. A contractor is required to know the law of the land and perform those actions, or they could get in trouble for it. Enforcement is simply this: a looming threat of punishment. If they could get in trouble for it now or in the future, then it's enforced. Will they get in trouble if they don't build it correctly? Let's find out. These provisions shall be known as the building code of the city of Galveston and shall be cited as such and will be referred therein as this code. Any person violating any provision of this code shall be guilty of a Class C misdemeanor and upon conviction thereof shall be assessed a fine. Each day a violation continues shall constitute a new and separate offense. Down below, it says the commission may impose an administrative penalty, occupations code on a building owner for a violation of this chapter or a rule adopted under this chapter. Each day that is a violation is not corrected is a separate violation. They can literally impose a penalty to the homeowner or the building owner if the contractor doesn't do things correctly. There's a looming threat to both the policyholder and the contractor. Is it enforced? Yeah. That sounds horrible. I don't want to get fined. Many cities say that it is a misdemeanor per day. Just because they don't go and investigate it on that day doesn't mean that they can't get fined down the road. When the policyholder has something happen and an inspector comes out and they realize, oh, somebody did something wrong, let's go back through the records and find out who that was. And now you're going to get a big old fine. There's a looming threat down the road of punishment. It doesn't have to be someone watching you ready to slap your hand at that moment. It's still enforced. We don't really need to worry about all of this argument because the city clearly indicates that the building official shall enforce this chapter and all of the building codes, which aren't optional. Go back to the damaged or undamaged part. Enforcement of the building law must directly apply to the repair of that specific part which has sustained the covered damage, or an undamaged part which is physically necessary in the course of repairs to complete the repair of the damaged part that sustained the covered damage. So the building code still has to apply to the damaged portion of the building. There might be coverage for undamaged part of the building. What does a part of a building mean? When we're talking about undamaged parts of a structure, are we talking about individual shingles? No. Maybe. Yeah. Sometimes. It's ambiguous as hell. It can be read that way. You have a broad and a narrow interpretation of that. Part of the building could be individual nails, or it could be roof. Coverages have changed over the years. They used to say we'll repair or replace a damaged part or the damaged dwelling with materials of like kind of quality for the lowest of the amount following, whatever. We will repair or replace the damaged dwelling. And then it became we will repair or replace the damaged part of the dwelling. And now a lot of policies say we will repair or replace the damaged component of the damaged part of the dwelling. Those are very different things. Semantics really matter. There are contradictions, there are comparisons, there are omissions in policies. If you can pay attention to the wording that's in it, it makes a huge difference. I love getting into the language of policies. It's like a puzzle. There's going to be something in there that is just absolute garbage. How do I prove that it's ambiguous if I'm a public adjuster, I'm not in front of a judge? How does someone prove that? I tricked you all. I actually moved into my second topic that I actually wanted to do already. Farmer Smart Plan, which I have been talking about so far, has some pretty glorious things in it. It is very wordy. It is very specific. Most policies are not. It's very broad. If an adjuster says that their policy pays for it this way and their policy doesn't actually say that, we can prove that they're full of shit just by showing them a policy that does actually say that. This Farmer Smart Plan probably says it exactly the way that they're saying. Well, Mr. Adjuster, if your policy really says what you're saying that it says, then why doesn't it say it like the Farmer Smart Plan does? Here's an excerpt. See how it actually spells out what you just said? Your policy doesn't spell it out that way. Here's your policy language. If your policy language actually said what you're saying that it said, then it would have said what you're saying that it said like the Farmer Smart Plan did. That is very hard for them to argue against. It's a beautiful thing. Look at what's in here. We do not insure any type of warranty. That's actually written in a Farmer Smart Plan. Do you know what that means? Any policy that doesn't say that does pay for warranties. How many times have you heard an insurance adjuster say, we don't pay for warranty? I've heard that a lot. Maybe it's Georgia. It's beautiful. It's the worst policy in the world. And it's gorgeous. Reasonably necessary replacement cost may be based on discounted pricing we obtain. Liberty Mutual has been giving discounted pricing on their estimates for years using Mad Sky. They don't have that in their policy. Does that mean that they can't? I think it does. Because Farmers spelled it out, but Liberty Mutual didn't. Farmers can do it. If Liberty Mutual does it, they might be violating their policy if they force you to use that particular pricing. It's beautiful. Any demand for appraisal must be made within the contractual suit limitation period is written in the farmer's policy. I have had carriers tell me that if I file a demand for appraisal after the suit limitation period, that they don't have to do it. And that's false because they didn't say it. Farmers did. And because I have an example to say, farmers put it in their policy for a reason. They don't add words in there arbitrarily. They don't need to put this in there just to clarify shit. Policies don't clarify things generally. If it doesn't say that, then that means that it is available. And in a state like Georgia, where I might have a 1-year suit limitation period, depending on the peril, I might have to file appraisal demand after the suit limitation period has expired. Now, if they say no, I can't sue them. So I have no leverage anyway. But a Department of Insurance might care. And they happen to on a few of my files. And then we got to appraise it. And then they paid the award after a suit limitation period. Because they still owe for a loss after the suit limitation period. It doesn't stop their obligation, it just means you can't sue them anymore. How many years you guys got in Texas? Suit limitation. How many? 2? I honestly thought it was 3. 2? But it's for all perils? Sometimes you're gonna hit that. You have to track that. Settlement for covered loss or damage to a specific individual component part of the dwelling or separate structures, except for roof materials and fences, will be settled at reasonable and necessary replacement costs without deduction for depreciation. They specifically state component parts and they define it. If your policy doesn't say that settlement will be covered for the specific individual component parts, then can they specify that individual shingles are separate coverages? They can't. Farmers can. And later on they say, we do not cover as part of the settlement of covered loss any consequential loss or damage to property which is a result of a condition which is excluded, which is wear and tear. Consequential loss or damage to property which is a result of a condition of wear and tear is not covered by their policy. That means if you have additional damages that occur from your repairs because shingles are brittle, that is a function of wear and tear. It's the result of a condition of wear and tear that they became damaged. They don't cover it. Every other policy that doesn't say that does. So if they say we're not paying for it because it's wear and tear, that policy says it. Yours doesn't. If yours said what you're saying that it says, then it would say it. Which is so much fun to say on the phone, by the way. It's incredibly fun. You should record that every chance you get, because they get a little bit mixed up. You guys, I think I blasted through this a lot faster than I anticipated. Who has questions on ordinance and law? Does it make sense? The increased cost only. Not all of it. But if coverage A is exhausted and it says compliance in their building code coverage, you can use ordinance and law for anything. You don't have to have all of coverage A exhausted to dip into ordinance and law. Increased costs are going to exist anytime there's a building code upgrade where they change something. They're going to change the thickness of decking requirement. 3/8 probably won't be the minimum after a while. I bet they get rid of OSB even at some point. They've done that in a lot of municipalities, especially in high wind zones. If you have OSB, there is a replacement cost value for that. If you're moving to plywood, what's the difference in cost? The labor's the same, although you could argue that the plywood's a little bit heavier, so maybe they should charge a little bit more, but there's a give and take. The guys are going to get stronger. It's one way to pay them. But whatever that difference in material cost is what should go under ordinance and law, not all the decking. So compliance with a building ordinance and law, possibly because the manufacturer requirements are part of building code. I don't know if the warranty is. Here's the thing, RCV covers replacement with new materials. It's always new. If you ask them what replacement pays for, they won't tell you it's new, but it is. And you know that because there's no depreciation. You start with a replacement cost with new and you depreciate it down to its age. If there's no depreciation, there's no age whatsoever, it's new. All right? So replacement is always new. New materials always have a warranty. If you destroy the warranty immediately, you're not replacing with new anymore. It's not replacement cost anymore. That's the argument I've made over the years when this wasn't available. Now that this is available, you can just say, hey, your policy doesn't really say that. Farmers does. How come yours doesn't say it? Here's an excerpt from Farmers. Go pound sand. All right, so if you go to their website, the city website, county website, whatever it is, and you find out what building code they have adopted, it very well might say what building code they enforce. If it says enforce, it's glorious because it's in writing and it says that they enforce it. And that's what they asked you for. It's not part of the policy that they ask you to have something in writing that says they enforce it from the city, but you do still have to prove the loss, right? So if you find that, great. If you don't find that, you can say what codes are adopted. You can go to Chapter 1, and then it says that the building official will enforce these codes. And now you have the enforcement language from Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is often edited by the cities or the counties, though, so you want to find their adopted version of Chapter 1, and then snippet that and send that to the carrier. The thing is, the carrier's language in the ordinance and law is going to specify some information, like Farmers did, that really gives you a basis to work from. The building law must be adopted by the local government in which the dwelling is located. Is it adopted? It's adopted. Be enforced on the date of loss. Was it enforced on the day of loss? If it's that, yes. You can number these things and say, yes, yes, yes. Directly apply to that part of the dwelling or structure. Are they talking about roofs, or are they talking about electrical suddenly and the damage is on a roof? If it meets these requirements, you've met the policy obligations for enforcement, even though it's not really spelled out, but it's ambiguous as hell. And someone's going to use the word enforcement differently depending on what jargon they're using. There's colloquial language that we use where we say enforce all the time. No one enforces that stop sign because no one's ever there. No, they do. It's enforced because it's a law that is the law of the land that is always there. You still are breaking the law. Is there a looming threat of punishment? And technically, it's enforced by every definition that you could find. Could you get fined for doing it a different way? You could fill out the way that the insurance company is saying into a permit, pay the permit fees, and have the building official withhold it or decline it. And say no. And then you could turn that into the insurance company and say, they would let me do it the way that you're saying. So it must be enforced. Sometimes the building officials don't want to play ball because they don't want to get involved with the freaking insurance company because they're tired of it, because they get pulled into this shit all the time. And sometimes the insurance company is going to say, hey, we called the building official and they said it wasn't enforced. And they have no record of the call. And they don't give you a copy of a recording. And they definitely didn't invite you to the call. If you ask the building official later on how that call went, if they happen to remember, sometimes you can find out that the insurance company adjuster, whoever it was who's calling, was leading them on. Not like, hey, but like leading them, leading a witness, which is what contractors and PAs do all the time with them too. But at least we try to put in writing or have a recording to be able to provide them with some kind of evidence. If we prove the loss, and we prove that it is in force at the time of loss for that part of the dwelling, and it is adopted by that county or that city, and there's a building official that is required to enforce it, if we prove all that, the onus is on them to disprove it. We've provided everything that we need to prove the loss. Now they have to prove that there's an exclusion. They didn't define the word enforce. It's really hard for public adjusters to win arguments on ambiguous terms. We're not going to get an insurance company to agree that their policy is ambiguous. You realize what would happen if that occurred? The universe would end. It's impossible. Their legal departments will never let them define something that isn't defined because there's going to be long-term consequences for that insurance company if they do that. Look, Mr. Adjuster, I'm not trying to get you to agree that you're wrong. I'm not trying to get you to define something that's not defined in your policy. I know you're not allowed to do that. My client is willing to settle on a compromise basis for the amount of blah, 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 blah. Let them go there, especially if they get to the point where they're saying our position stands. Sue us, because they just want to settle outside of court so there's no record of them agreeing that they were wrong, sometimes. You're a contractor though, right? No PA in Ohio on that one? Yeah. So building code, getting the building official, if you happen to know that this is the language in the policy and you can prove that without actually quoting the policy, you've done your due diligence to force them into something else, let the policyholder see that you've done that. This is a difficult thing to fight with an insurance company on many times. But the reality is, if you can get a building official on board because they're pissed off about it, great. If you wanted to hire an engineer that said that it was enforced in that county or something, submit that with a permit or some kind. Permitting office, if you actually pay for the permit, will play ball with you a lot more than if you just ask them questions. If you actually pay for a permit, put some things in writing, and let them say no or decline or withhold or whatever, you can use that to your advantage quite often as a contractor. But it's going to cost you some money. Grease those palms, man. By paying for a permit fee and not by bribing anybody for the recording. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Disclaimer, I'm not an attorney. I have no idea what I'm talking about. You should be skeptical about everything that I say. Probably bullshitting you right now. Maybe. Does anybody have any questions?
Let's, if we can have some time at the reception and we can get on some more of these follow-up questions. if it's all right, we can get our next speaker up. But let's get a round of applause for the bull, Mr. Mathew Mulholland. Our next speaker.